So, shall we start?
Yes. Yes.
So, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Hugh Tuckfield, Executive Director of the Indo-Pacific Study Centre. And on behalf of the Indo-Pacific Study Centre team, it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Strategic Undercurrents, Mapping Threats to Undersea Communication Cables Across the Indo-Pacific. This topic couldn't be more timely or important, as undersea cables carry over 95% of the world's digital data. They are vital infrastructure, yet they remain largely invisible and increasingly vulnerable in an era of strategic competition and cyber risk. We are honoured today to be joined today by Dr. Brendon Cannon, Associate Professor of International Security at Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi. Dr. Cannon is a leading voice in maritime security and Indo-Pacific geopolitics, and his work sheds light on how infrastructure like submarine cables is reshaping regional dynamics. So before I hand over to our speaker, a quick note. Today's session is recorded. Please keep your microphones muted, and you're welcome to submit questions in the Zoom Q&A box during the presentation. Dr. Mancy, would you like to say something before we start?
Yes. Hugh, I think your voice is breaking. You were stuck or something.
Oh, no.
Yeah, okay. Okay, a very good evening to everyone and welcome to the fourth webinar in the series of Indo-Pacific Center 2025 initiative. On behalf of the center, I, Dr. Mansi, the Deputy Director of the center, am honored to host today's event, and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you. As you might be aware, that this webinar series has been thoughtfully curated as a lead up to the key program, which IPSC will be hosting this year, like the State of Indo-Pacific 2025 conference, to be held most likely in New Delhi in the month of October. The leadership program, which we started today, and also the IPSC certificate in strategic geopolitical analysis of the Indo-Pacific affair. The aim of the webinar is to offer valuable context, insight, and engagement as we approach the rest of the event. On that note, it is our privilege to have Dr. Brendon with us today. And as you've already introduced him, I would just like to add a few more points that about Dr. Cannon's research. So his research is at the intersection of the security studies, geopolitics, and role of transformative technologies, with a particular emphasis on the maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. He has published extensively on the undersea infrastructure, which includes undersea communication cable, maritime global governance, and maritime defense. His work posits the Indo-Pacific as a body of a strategic and normative concept shaped by classical geopolitical framework. And Dr. Cannon's publication appeared in many forums, like many forums on the marine policy, global policy, defense studies, international politics, and African security. His book, Indo-Pacific Strategies, Navigating Geopolitics at the Dawn of a New Age, published by Routledge in 2022 and co-edited with Kei Hakata, delves into the evolving alignment and power dynamics across the Indo-Pacific. Now, as mentioned already, that Dr. Cannon will be speaking on strategic undercurrents, mapping threats to undersea communication cable across the Indo-Pacific. And as a prominent expert on undersea infrastructure, particularly the strategic importance and vulnerability of the communication cable in the Indo-Pacific, Dr. Cannon is uniquely positioned to guide us through this pressing and timely issue. Now, without further ado, let us invite Dr. Cannon. And Dr. Cannon, the floor is all yours. You can just go ahead and share your screen with us. Yeah, over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hugh and Dr. Mansi. Pleasure to meet you, Dr. Hugh, and pleasure to see you again, Dr. Mansi, after our time at the Maritime Security Conference in Goa in March. So let me figure out how to share my screen. There we go. And okay, let me see if I can get us a slideshow view here. Is that working in slideshow mode or not?
Not yet.
How's that?
Yes, yeah. It's in the slideshow now.
Okay, great. All right. Well, again, thanks for having me today. It's getting to be rather lengthy introductions for me. I'm not quite sure that I deserve all of that, but look, the work I've done on undersea cables broadly fits into security studies and Indo-Pacific geopolitics, which I've been working on for nearly 10 years. If we look back, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe first used the term free and open Indo-Pacific when I was living in Nairobi back in 2016. And I didn't take much notice of it at the time, but shortly thereafter in 2017, it was raised to my attention by a colleague of mine, Dr. Ash Roster, here in Abu Dhabi at Cleef University, and we and others have been working on this for many, many years. To include lots of great scholars from Indo-Pacific states as well as third countries as well. And so the undersea cables was something that came about because of that. Undersea cables, as I'll mention, have been around for a long time, and but they've recently come to our attention in quite stirring ways. So let's see if I can get to the next slide here. Yeah. Things like this happening. This is the MV Rubimar. This was a ship that was hit by a missile launched by the Houthi in Yemen last year. And as it was listing on its way to the bottom of the ocean, its anchor was dragging, and its anchor ran across the ocean floor, grabbed a hold of an undersea cable, and ripped it apart, okay, severed it. And so this was one of the major news stories about the threat to undersea cable, the evolving risks to undersea infrastructure that has become stock in trade when we talk about Indo-Pacific and great power rivalry, et cetera, et cetera. The Houthi immediately denied that they had had anything to do with the cable. They admitted they hit the ship. But they also offered immediately to give any assistance necessary to cable repair ships that needed to come into the region so the cable could be repaired. And this underscores for not only, say, a malicious actor like the Houthi, but others in the world, that attacking cables is problematic. And I'll get into some of the complexities of this, but you're never quite sure who you're going to hurt most when it comes to sabotage, right? And so we'll talk about the risk of espionage as well. If I miss those in my comments, we can talk about those in the question and answer session. But as mentioned in the introduction, look, cables are responsible for certainly 95 and up to 99% of global digital traffic. That's financial, that's intelligence, that's the backbone of our generative AI that we all use on a daily basis now. This all relies on these undersea cables. An instance like that in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which connects the Gulf of Aden to the Red Sea, as well as the Baltic Sea, 2 cable cuts in the last 2 years, and the Taiwan Strait in between Taiwan and China. These have exposed cable vulnerability. Because they are globally distributed, they are difficult to monitor or protect, and this has largely been the preserve of private industry, okay? But what we can say with certainty, even though I do believe this is still something of a storm in a teacup, is that cables are increasingly targeted in hybrid warfare contexts and are brought on. The impetus for them is geopolitical rivalries in the international system. Here's a great map of undersea cables by telegeography. You can use these maps for non-commercial reproduction educational use free of charge as long as you give them credit. And they put out maps on a yearly basis. They do regional maps as well. They're fantastically good. But this begins to give you a picture of how interconnected our world's oceans are. Cables are triply invisible. This was famously written by a good friend of mine, Christian Buger, who some of you know, who's a maritime security expert, undersea cable security expert, primarily focused on the Western Indian Ocean and security dynamics there. And he talked about this in an article of his back in 2021. They're triply invisible because, number one, they're infrastructure. And we just don't often notice infrastructure around us because it does stuff. And until it breaks, or until it's severed, or until the lights go out, if you will, we don't notice it. The second thing is that the undersea cables are, well, under the sea, okay? And most of us don't live below the sea last time I checked, and so we don't see them there. Third, they're actually buried underneath the seabed, okay? So there's your triple invisibility of these. And this has had some consequences in terms of why we didn't talk about them up to a certain point and why we're talking about them now. I've done another screenshot of just a closer look around India, for example, since a lot of our guests today are probably from India and South Asia region, but also the Indo-Pacific in general. You can see how interconnected everything is from the Western Indian Ocean to the Western Pacific. You can also see how cables like maritime shipping routes are narrowed down into so-called choke points at certain places. So the Bab el-Mandeb Strait I already mentioned, in Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, Strait of Hormuz in the Gulf, Strait of Malacca between Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and then on up into the South China Sea, which itself is a choke point. Yeah, you can see how complex this is and how much redundancy there is in the cable systems. So let's talk about this. Cables aren't new. Cables have been around for nearly 150 years. First cables were laid in the Atlantic in the 1800s, mid-1800s, the first across the English Channel between England and France. And states quickly developed what would be termed national networks. When I was in Japan last year in the fall, in November, doing research on undersea cables, amongst other things, I had the opportunity to travel from Tokyo south down to the Ryukyu Island chain, down to an island called Ishigaki Island, which is due east of Taiwan. So that gives you an idea of how far south it is in Japan. And the reason this was interesting is because it was the site of one of the original cable landing stations built by the Japanese imperial government back in the late 1890s, early 1900s. And you can see in the map, I assume it'll be on your left, you can see Taiwan at the bottom and then an undersea cable or a line that connects Ishigaki Island next, on up to Okinawa, landfall in another Ryukyu Island chain, and then on up to Kagoshima on mainland Japan, if you will. And this was kind of the backbone of communication that knit the Japanese Empire at the time in the early 1900s together. And it played a really important role. This little building with bullet holes in it that's abandoned is the old cable landing site. The bullet holes were from the American invasion at the end of World War II, but this was the cable landing station back in the early 1900s. And if you recall, in 1904 and 5, Japan fought a brief and successful war against the Russian Empire. And one of the concerns the Japanese had as they were prosecuting this war against Russia was that Russia was sending its Baltic Sea fleet, a huge naval force, all the way from the Baltic, around Africa, through the Indian Ocean, then on up to relieve Port Arthur in what's now China, Russian possession at the time. And the Japanese didn't know when and where it would show up. Fortunately, they had a cable landing station on Ishigaki, and fortunately and bravely, 5 fishermen were informed by the mayor of a neighboring island called Miyako that the Baltic Sea Fleet had been sighted, except that Miyako didn't have a cable landing site. So these 5 fishermen rowed for 6 kilometers across choppy seas and then walked for 5 hours overland on Ishigaki Island to get to that cable landing site and then cable this information to Tokyo. And they were able to intercept the Baltic Fleet and destroy it. So there's your importance of cable landing sites 100 years ago. Now, as I mentioned, though, these were largely developed as national cable networks built by Japanese and European powers primarily to knit their empires, colonial empires, together. So the British, of course, had one that would have connected South Asia, India at the time, to Aden in Yemen and Mombasa in Kenya, et cetera, et cetera. The French had the same. The Germans had the same as well. And one of the things that happened in World War I is that the British quickly realized they could handicap their German adversaries very quickly by not only cutting the German network cables, which they did quite quickly, but they left a few of them because somebody very, very smart realized they could also tap them for espionage purposes. Okay, and this leads to a long history of tapping cables for espionage purposes. And one of the things that came out of that was the so-called Zimmermann telegram, which is the telegram you see in the bottom left there, that the British intercepted and decoded. This was a German message sent to Mexico City, urging the Mexicans to attack the United States. And if they did so and were successful along with Germany, then Germany would gift them the former Mexican territories, states like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. The Mexicans wisely declined, but the British gleefully sent this to Washington, and it was one of the reasons why the United States eventually joined the war against Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Okay, flash forward, now we're in the present day, another age of great power rivalry, another day of attempts to redistribute power on a global scale. And we've got a different world. There are no longer national networks, and there haven't been really since post-World War I. We've got instead, as those maps showed you, a string of spaghetti around the world that is very, very interconnected and very, very redundant. And yet, starting about 5-6 years ago, but most of this has come post-COVID-19 pandemic, the academic and policy community began to wake up to this idea that cables were somehow the next target of in a conflict, a great power conflict, or in hybrid warfare scenarios, et cetera, et cetera. And since then, there's been a lot of articles written, some of them by myself, building on the work of others who came before, certainly. And there's been a lot of pointing out of patents and other material that could potentially help a malicious actor sabotage undersea cables, one of which you can see in the news brief there, a cable cutting anchor that was patented by the Chinese in 2021, I believe. All right. So let's look at cable security and cable protection. There's an article I wrote earlier this year or last year about 3 levels of cable protection. First of all, you can try to wall off your network, essentially build a national network again. And this, I found, was really impractical and costly because it undermines connectivity more than anything else. Remember, one of the most important things that somebody from the cable industry pointed out to me is that the cables themselves are not that valuable. It's the data that goes across them that's so valuable, okay? The cables are the conduits, if you will. And so if Russia, as it's threatened, builds a new national network, not only is it costly, but the reality is that it might even encourage sabotage by malicious actors because it truly becomes a national network again, and then there's no boomerang effect if a cable is cut. Furthermore, again, the value is in the data transmitted, and if it's only Russian data going across these cables, then the likelihood of them being financially feasible and valuable drops quite a bit. Okay. The second part is to build resilience. This is feasible. This has been done by the cable industries in general. It's likely the best option, but of course it makes cable still vulnerable to geopolitical tensions. All right. But industry professionals, the few of whom will talk about this, point out very clearly that redundancy is the name of the game. Redundancy and sharing agreements between cable operators and telcos. All right. So what happened when the MV Rubimar sank and severed that cable in the Red Sea was that there was a downgrade in internet connectivity across much of the Middle East, Eurasia in general, even East Africa. And the cable operator based in Hong Kong quickly was able to reroute that traffic northwards from Hong Kong through China and then on over to Europe, north again, but northwest through cables in the Western Pacific, through North America to Europe, and then another cable down through the Indian Ocean. So there's that kind of connectivity and redundancy built into the network. The final option would be to make this a normative standard or argument, if you will. So similar to save the whales, you would have hands off our cables. This is something that's a global common. It's something we all use. It's something our countries rely on, our economies rely on, for example. So therefore, an attack against one cable is an attack against us all, okay? Well, that's pretty hard to build consensus in today's world. And if you think about the global response to those Houthi attacks on international shipping, it's pretty disappointing. If there was a moment in time when rival states could have gotten together, US, China, Russia, European Union, everybody, and condemned attacks on neutral international shipping, that was the time to do it. But of course, it was used for political purposes. So I wouldn't hang a lot of hope on establishing norms here. They're ideal and also they're ideal, but also very, very fragile, and they're almost impossible to enforce during conflict. Okay, so where are we at then? What we set out to do, and when I say we, myself and a team of researchers from Japan for a group called Global Infrastructure Foundation Research Fund Japan. So some research interns and we set out to answer some questions about the vulnerabilities of cables, the risks cable security faces in this age of heightened geopolitical tensions. So questions: where and under what conditions can states prioritize cable security? Because as you saw in those maps, how do you possibly protect all of those cables? Okay. Which cables are most likely to be attacked and by whom? All right. So again, looking at intent and capability here, all right, as well as vulnerability. And then how do patterns of threat or risk rather evolve across different levels of geopolitical tensions? So one of the research interns who presented something similar with me in Tokyo a couple of weeks ago took care of the methodology and methods section of this. So, but I'll attempt to do it justice in the way that he did. But so what we did is we took 3 cables across the Indo-Pacific, 2 in the Pacific, one that stretches from Chikura, Japan to Redondo Beach, California in the United States, which you can see on the left, the one in the middle from a section of a cable, the Asia-America Gateway cable from Guam to Hawaii. And then importantly for South Asia and the Indian Ocean, we took a tier 1 provider cable carrying massive amounts of data. The TGN Tata Indicom cable stretches from Singapore to Chennai in India. We based our study on 2 key assumptions. The likelihood of sabotage may be dependent on ocean zones. We've got legal classifications for ocean zones. You've got your high seas, right? So in the middle of the Pacific or Atlantic or Indian Ocean, the Southern Indian Ocean, for example, that's the high seas. It's nobody's territorial sea or anything like that. As you get closer to land, for example, India, you've got exclusive economic zones. You have huge EEZs around small island states, for example, Seychelles has probably one of the biggest EEZs in the world. And then you have territorial seas, which are close in, bordering ports like Chennai, for example. And then the second assumption is the threat or the risk to undersea communication cables varies depending on the levels of tension in the international system. Well, that's kind of a no-brainer, but again, we have to lay out exactly what we're doing here. And so we've got 4 levels, and we define these levels, although I'll admit they're random, but we've got peacetime, wartime, and then in the middle we've got low tension and high tension. Okay. All right. And then we went to experts. Okay, these were maritime security experts. So they could have a background, a defense background. They could be security studies scholars who have done things on undersea cables, like Dr. Pooja Bhatt in Delhi, for example. We also tried to get industry experts as well. All right. And we ended up sending this to about 30 experts. We got, 29, it says right here. We got responses from 17 of these. All right. And so we had them plot their answers, just as it's shown in the window here, looking at levels of tension and the 3 different cables here. Okay. So, and then we took the survey responses and we mapped them via heat map sensing. Okay. And so to do so, we've got the 3 cables here. You can see, the more red there is, the more risk there is. And so the main takeaways here are, as regional or international tensions rise, risks of sabotage also increase. So Chikura in Japan, the landing site in Japan for one of those cables, as well as Guam, is more vulnerable to sabotage than Redondo Beach or Hawaii in the United States. Okay, we'll explain some of the reasons why. Next, vulnerability of cables does vary by maritime zone. Remember, high seas, EEZs, and territorial seas. And the Tata TGN Indicom cable was perceived by experts to be lower risk overall than the other 2 cables. Okay. All right. So interesting. But then we asked our experts during the surveys, would you be amenable to us contacting you afterwards to follow up on some of these questions in a survey, in a semi-structured interview? And so we conducted interviews with 6 experts and asked them a number of questions here, some of which I've listed here. So for example, what factors make certain landing stations like Chikura more vulnerable compared to others like Redondo Beach? What geopolitical, military, operational factors explain risk variation by maritime zone? Remember, EEZ, high seas, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Then we asked a couple of questions, for example, about the Tata TGN cable. Why was that assessed at lower risk? Okay. And then we took all of this, like I said, and kind of aggregated it with these means of levels of tension as well as the likelihood cable. Okay, and the result of this was quite interesting, and so I'm not doing very well on time here. I'm going to finish soon, but we've got lots to talk about. So one of the things that came out of this is no surprise: geographic proximity leads to more vulnerability, leads to more risk. Okay, so think about this in terms of Chikura landing station in Japan or Guam in the Western Pacific. As compared to the Tata TGN Indicom cable. All right. Proximity to adversarial states or contested maritime zones significantly elevates sabotage risks. And I would add as well espionage risks. Okay. So experts, when we discussed these findings from the surveys with them, they said, yes, it does have something to do with geographic proximity. The highest tensions right now are between China and, say, like-minded Indo-Pacific states, but tensions, precisely because of Taiwan, really, are higher in the Western Western Pacific than they are in, say, the Bay of Bengal because of that. And therefore, Chikura, for example, and Guam, which are closer to adversarial states such as China, North Korea, and Russia, face higher risks of sabotage than, say, Redondo Beach in California or the cable in the Indian Ocean. Now, I will say that there was a lot of nuance in these answers. Some pointed out that yes, geographic proximity has a role to play, but bathymetry plays a role too. So what does the seabed look like, right? How deep are the cables? Bear in mind, for example, some of the Indian experts told us in particular how deep the Bay of Bengal is, right? So deeper means more difficult to get, and only states with extremely advanced technologies are going to be able to necessarily do this in a manner that is not extremely alerting. Okay. Furthermore, say in an inland sea like the Bay of Bengal, there's a heightened security awareness, right, on both the Indian side as well as, say, on the part of Southeast Asian states, which may play a role in mitigating this. Furthermore, we could expect that if geopolitical tensions rise between China and India, for example, therefore the Tata TGN cable and other cables in the Indian Ocean may be higher risk than, say, those in the Western Pacific. So there are some variables here that need to be looked at. Policy prescriptions, which we are still refining for a journal article, which I just sent to the research interns today for their final look over before we submit it. Strengthen surveillance at vulnerable landing stations. So Chikura would be one of them. You need to decide which landing stations are more vulnerable. Chennai would certainly be one of them in India. Okay. If it's possible, deploying autonomous underwater monitoring. I mean, this is something that advanced states like India, the United States, and China are doing or are working on. It's usually in the realm of classified information still, so you're not going to get a lot of clarity on that. I certainly couldn't. But as importantly, states need to start looking at getting their own house in order here. Okay. I was in a meeting online that was held in Washington in May of last year. There were between 60 and 70 people attending this brainstorming session with a major think tank in Washington. The majority of those were Americans in the United States, to include former admirals, to include people from all of the alphabet soup of agencies and departments in Washington, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, people from Capitol Hill. Then we had a couple of people from outside of the US, to include me, though I am an American, but some experts from India as well. And what was interesting to me and my Indian colleagues in particular was not only the Amerocentricity of the whole thing, no surprise about that, but also that there was an element of we can somehow secure all cables around the world, and that's patently impossible, okay? And so when I say states need to get their own house in order first before you start looking for, say, regional approaches to cable security, which I'll talk about a little bit later, you've got to know the legal and regulatory issues at play in your own state. You've got to have a single point of contact for external states to be able to reach in and say, hey, who in Delhi takes care of undersea cables? Because we in country X nearby would like to work on a regional security approach with you, or would like to better secure our cables with you, et cetera, et cetera. So very, very important. And surprisingly, this is not very robust in most countries. This is something that experts from the Baltic Sea region, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, et cetera, have said to me is that even there, where it's very clear that cables are under a higher risk given shallow seabed and geopolitical tensions, that even there, certain states don't or haven't made this leap yet. Poland is the exception, but Denmark, for example, it's unclear whose jurisdiction it is even after cables have been sabotaged. Is it the police? Is it the intelligence? Is it the military, right? Where's private industry in this? And I will point out that the vast majority, actually certainly all of these cables right now are operated and repaired by private industry. It might be useful when I'm still talking about that to point out that there are three major cable industry layers and distributors and repair entities in the world, followed by a distant fourth. The first is Subcom in the United States. The second is Alcatel in France. The third is NEC in Japan. And a distant fourth is Huawei, known as HMN Tech in China. There are reasons why Huawei is now a distant fourth, although it was climbing up the ranks very quickly in the 2010s. That's because of some concerted pushback by the United States on a unilateral basis, beginning back in 2017, 2018, 2019, as well as the Quad, which in 2023 in Hiroshima and Japan advocated for a cable resilience package, which is being led by Australia right now. And we can talk about that as well. That's the subject of another article I've written. Okay, second, data transmission. One of the things that was really interesting, and you'll remember I already pointed out that cables themselves aren't that important. It's the data that goes over them. So data sensitivity as well as the amount of data is really important. It's not just geographic location alone. Now you'd think, okay, so there's the cable. There's a cable here that has carrying lots of data, so it's great. I'm gonna cut that one. But this was actually one of the reasons given for tensions or risks being lower, being lower in the Bay of Bengal and that Tata TGN cable, is because it is a tier 1 provider cable, meaning it carries massive amounts of data for at least tens of countries, okay? And so if someone had the temerity to sabotage this cable, it's going to not only, say, hurt India, for example, it's going to hurt 18 other countries as well, to include possibly the malicious actor who sabotaged it in the first place. And unless you want the rest of the region, and I'm saying the wider region, not just the Bay of Bengal region, up in arms about this, it might be a cause for pause in terms of why you would sabotage a cable. Okay. Needless to say, cables carrying military, diplomatic, or financial data face heightened threats. Well, there's a lot of financial data going across most cables. One of the reasons cited for Guam being higher risk is because of proximity, number one, but also because of the huge amount of military traffic that goes across that with the US military, but also the fundamental importance of it for the Japanese self-defense forces as well. Interestingly, a lot of the drones consume a huge amount of data. And so drones in the Guam, Western Pacific theater would consume massive amounts of data from those cables. And if the cables were sabotaged, the drones would be unable to fly. So that's an interesting facet as well that came out from those expert interviews. I already mentioned Tata TGN there. So your policy prescription, you've got to map and prioritize cables based on your data sensitivity, as well as just your vulnerabilities in your region as well. And then, of course, advanced encryption, the race to quantum as part of this would be one of the ways to protect against that. All right, risks in transitional periods. So no surprise, these gray zones or these ambiguous periods between high and low tensions, or between peacetime and wartime, this is where we start to see more risk to cable infrastructure in general. Okay, risks peak when adversaries use deniable disruptive actions. This is the classic case in the Baltic, where the Nunu polar bear, Chinese flagged ship, and then another one more recently, Chinese flagged Russian crew, dragging anchors repeatedly across the seabed, sever cables. Depending on who you talk to, this is a malicious act or it's just accidental. And so, the ship's crew is drunk or something. Either way, the Finns, the Swedes, the Danes, et cetera, furious, impounded the ship. Meanwhile, states like the US said, well, maybe it was an accident. Perfect for gray zone hybrid warfare tactics, right? So if possible, you develop early warning and rapid response capabilities. This is something that I like to point out in a lot of the articles I've written and policy recommendations with cables and cable security, is that the way you fix cables when they've been damaged, either natural damage from, say, an earthquake or a tsunami, as happened in the case of Fiji, which is connected by one cable to the world a few years back, or malicious, man-made damage is you use cable repair ships. So these are cable laying ships that you would then be able to lower down a device, an anchor, if you will, pick that cable up off the seabed floor and be able to repair it on the deck of the ship in the middle of the ocean. When I checked earlier today, there's about 60 of these ships worldwide. Okay, that's a lot of ocean to cover for 60 ships. And one of the policy recommendations that I and Dr. Pujabat and others have recommended is that the Quad, for example, pool resources for more cable repair ships. All right. This regional seas approach is not my own idea. This again comes from Christian Buger, who I mentioned earlier, scholar at the University of Copenhagen, who's done a huge amount of work on maritime security and cables. So global governance in cables is absolutely fragmented. It doesn't exist, okay? And so it's particularly unworkable now. The tensions are so high, for example, between the US and China. So a regional seas approach offers something of a partial solution. So this would allow neighboring states to pool resources, monitor cable corridors, respond faster to sabotage threats, right? But you can think about the complexity of this already when you look at the Arabian Sea on one side of India and the Bay of Bengal on the other. This is no walk in the park, is it? So again, it's a beginning of a way to start to address these, but these cables, they make landfall in multiple locations, and they serve multiple countries. All right. So we're suggesting in this article, which we hope will be published sometime this year, to consider not just regional seas like the Bay of Bengal, but perhaps make new regional seas based on cable infrastructure. So you would have a regional sea in the Western Pacific that stretches from, say, Guam to the Philippines to Taiwan, up through the Ryukyu Island chain to Japan. That would be a regional seas approach, for example. All right. So this is really critical. Once states get their houses in order, then you'd be able to move to the regional seas approach. All right. All right. And then finally, the summary of the key findings. You can read through these here, but this is a really pithy version of what is going to be a much bigger article, like I said. And I got one more slide. Yeah, my conclusion here. Look for, as tensions continue to rise, should they, cables will likely become more vulnerable. I will say one final note, though, that cables, the list we have of actual malicious attacks against cable is very, very short. Okay. There are lots of cable outages and lots of cables damaged each year, but it's mostly accidental, right? So fishing fleets, fishing anchors, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not talking about what happened in the Baltic. I'm talking about worldwide now. Nets, dragging, et cetera, et cetera. That's one of the things, but also natural disasters and these separate cables. So that takes up the vast majority of a list of cable outages, and the list of malicious damage to cables, again, which can also be viewed as accidental, or at least claimed to be accidental, is very, very short. So you've got the Baltic Sea, and you've got the Matsu Islands off the coast of Taiwan, in between Taiwan and China. And that's about it. And so it's something to remember in context with this is we're not in an age where submarines are, skimming around underneath the ocean and with a big pair of scissors and cutting cables. We're not there yet. And hopefully we don't get there. All right. Again, states should get their own houses in order and adopt proactive scenario-based cable protection measures. You've got to take into account all of those things that are involved in risk matrices, right? Intent, capability, cable vulnerabilities, et cetera. And then again, regional seas approach, really important to this. And ideally, states would begin to pool their resources to do this. The Quad's taken the first stab at this, but it's really early days yet. And of course, they live, i.e. the 4 states of the Quad, live in very different geographies. They're separated by miles and miles and kilometers of sea, and therefore making a regional seas approach impossible with them. But perhaps it's a start. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. And I look forward to answering your questions about this or any other interesting facet of the Indo-Pacific you're interested in.
Thank you, Brandon, for such an amazing, engaging, and also an eye-opening talk for all of us. And it has actually helped us a lot to understand and grasp how important and vulnerable undersea cables are in today's geopolitical landscape. And I can see there are questions pouring in here. So let's just see what we got here. So many questions. Okay. So yeah. So the first question is by Natalie. In fact, she has two questions. So she's saying, how much of a deterrent is the ability to tap cable versus cutting off all comms and being left in dark on intelligence? Are we more concerned about these cables being tapped or cut? Then she's also saying that because the allies in Second World War wanted to keep the lines of communication open to be able to decipher Enigma encrypted communications to target German submarines. So the observation and also two questions from her. Over to you, Brandon.
Yeah. All right. Sorry, this keeps falling out of my ear for some reason. Okay, so very interesting question on sabotage versus espionage. And again, this is something I'm glad you brought up because I didn't talk about it as much as I wanted to. Espionage is the bigger problem. It's something that isn't talked about a lot in a lot of the cable policy recommendations and analyses, interestingly. But there's no doubt that this is really, I think, where the main threat comes from. So it's not so much disruption in terms of severing a cable or hampering communications, it's tapping into it. As an industry expert told me a couple of weeks ago, think of a ransomware attack, right? So if you think of a ransomware attack as you've been at work all day, you walk up to your home, get out your keys, and they no longer work to get in your house. Your house is still there. All of your stuff is still inside, but you can't get in and access it anymore, okay? And this would be something similar that would be done potentially with cables. So you're siphoning that data. And of course, you can do this in a much quieter way where nobody needs to necessarily know that you're siphoning the data, et cetera. Information is power. I mean, I don't want to take that argument too far, but certainly this is something that needs to be looked at. I will point out, however, in the history of intelligence and counterintelligence and espionage that this is likely being done by a lot of countries already on a day-to-day basis. So again, it's a question of how much this works for you, how much you want to point this out as a problem, depending on who you are. And so it's one thing for the US to call out China or China to call out the US, but maybe we're not going to call out other ourselves, certainly, or others who are doing so, whether it's the French or others. The second part was World War II. Remind me, Dr. Mansi, what that was?
Yeah. She just this is just a statement. She's saying that based on the question, she said that because the Allies in the Second World War wanted to keep the lines of communication open because they had to decipher Enigma to target the German submarine. So that was basically a context.
Yeah, and I could be wrong on this, but it was also a much more interconnected world already at that point. So cutting cables would have hurt the Germans too, potentially, but I could be wrong.
Okay. The next question we have from Captain Sabarjeet Parmar. He is also a fellow with us, and he is retired Indian Navy and has a lot of expertise in submarine and the maritime security. So he says, even NSAs and VNSAs use cable for routing of information, especially financial. This is perhaps clear given the offer of the Houthis to enable repair as mentioned by you. Hence, cable sabotage could be restricted to areas where the disruptor, including state actor, is not impacted. Identification and mapping of such vulnerable areas could ease the issue of protection. Could I request your views on this? And then he also says that regional seas are a good idea, but will have issues governed by regional geopolitics. How about looking at cables like train tracks with responsibility from landing station to landing station? Over to you, Brandon.
Okay, yeah, so this is getting more into the real technical industry side of cables, which I am absolutely not an industry expert or an engineer for that matter. So I'll answer it probably poorly on these questions. I like the idea of looking at cables in isolation, right? This is something we tried to do with this project. Again, it's we're grabbing three cables out of thin air, if you will, or out of the deep ocean, and we did so because we had the Indo-Pacific framework, which is why we used the Indo-Pacific cables. But we could have chosen three cables for each of that anywhere. Yeah, train tracks, yes and no. Again, I'm not really qualified to answer this, but the redundancy and the interconnection and also the kind of seamless connectivity that's developed around the world over the past 100 years, or certainly post World War II, by private industry is really what makes that approach maybe impossible. I don't know that's kind of the indication I'm getting from people in industry. So if I don't know what I'm talking about, forgive me, but that's my answer on that.
Thank you, Brandon. Moving ahead, we have a question from Jian Hong. And the question is, with the danger of hybrid warfare, how can one counter this possibility given the uses of plausible deniability being a key asset of hybrid warfare techniques? Over to you.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is something that my colleagues here, the Rabdout Security Institute, could answer really well for you because they work on hybrid warfare and countering that. So this is something I mentioned that the states surrounding the Baltic Sea have had to deal with for a number of years, given the omnipresence of Russia in their neighborhood. And so, yeah, early warning, detection. There's a lot of different solutions being bandied about in terms of how we can best protect this undersea infrastructure. Remember, it's not just cables. A lot of this interest in undersea infrastructure came about with the Nord Stream pipeline explosion a few years back, right? And so again, in the plausible deniability of all of that, it's really hard for states to react, certainly kinetically, if the malicious actor, assuming it is a malicious actor, begs off that it was just an accident, right? The captain was drinking too much that night, right? I mean, again, it's really difficult to then say, well, how dare you do this? And you have this huge diplomatic spat, let alone start a conflict. So this is where hybrid warfare, this is why we got into the territorial seas, EEZs, and high seas aspect of it, because we had an inkling, and I think anybody with a security studies or military background certainly understands that once you start attacking infrastructure in territorial seas, you're getting pretty close to attacking territories themselves. And of course, that's grounds for conflict almost every time that I'm aware of. And so this is why we don't see cable landing sites being blown up, for example. I mean, if you really want to damage cables, you would go to the landing point in Chikura in Japan or Chennai and destroy landing sites. That would really cripple communications massively because multiple cables make landfall there. Again, is there efficacy in doing this? Maybe if you're involved in an outright conflict, but at that point, a lot of infrastructure is going to be targeted, not just undersea cables. And maybe, as in the case of World War II, as our viewer pointed out, maybe undersea cables won't be targeted in an outright conflict, but everything else will be. So yeah, in terms of the hybrid warfare countering that, again, not an expert there, but it's hard to do this at the best of times, and especially at a time when many national governments are cutting budgets across the board for all this stuff. So yeah, it's one of these. It's one of many security threats that states have to look at in this time of heightened geopolitical tension around our globe.
Thank you, Brandon. We have a question from Priyangshu. He says, do you think India should engage with Japan in the Indo-Pacific region regarding maritime security in terms of research collaboration and scientific orientation?
Yes. Why not? I think one of the great things about India-Japan relations is how much they have matured, certainly over the past 10 years, as Japan has become under duress, I'll add, by China, a fully political power again, rather than just a global economic power. As India has also risen in status and power, but also in its threat assessment of what it faces in its near abroad, particularly vis-a-vis China. But a lot of this groundwork was laid by former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe back in 2005, 6, 7, even before he was Prime Minister. And so I'm currently writing a paper on this as well. And Japan's outreach to India and how that handshake or that proffered hand was actually met in kind under the Manmohan Singh prime ministership. And this was the kernel or the seed of the Quad, of course, in 2007 in Manila. So Japan-India relations were traditionally very, very good post-1945, post-1947, of course. Not so good after 1997, but improved greatly after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. So the answer is yes. The answer is yes to this, the Quad in general working closer together. This really falls apart, though, when it comes to different national security cultures, different cybersecurity cultures. It's a lot easier for Australia and the United States to work on these things, hence AUKUS, right? Given the similar approaches to intelligence, counterintelligence, secret sharing, et cetera, et cetera. It's much harder to bring the Japanese and the Indians into that, not because the desire's not there, not because the intent isn't there, but there's those differences there. And so, that some of this stuff gets into the highest technologies that would have high national security concerns around them. And that's very difficult for any country in a globe that is riven with mistrust to share those things. So short answer is yes, but we'll see how that works. The appetite's certainly there on both sides, in both Tokyo and Delhi.
That's true. Thank you, Brandon. Now we have a couple of questions on NATO. So we have a viewer from Department of Shipping, Trade and Transport in Greece, Dr. Yosef. And his question is, do you consider the existing capacity of private repair service provider adequate to mitigate the risk of critical undersea infrastructure and capable specifically? Do you think the new NATO Center of Excellence related to protection of CUI is the right step that the rest of the world, non-NATO, should replicate? So 2 questions from Yosef.
Okay, first answer to the first question is, I actually largely think that the way cables have been laid, operated, secured, repaired by private industry is sufficient. One of the things that I hear time and again over the past 3-4 years, 2-3 years, from industry, again, when they're willing to talk, is we've never seen this level of scrutiny before, right? We've never seen this level of politicization and, frankly, securitization of cables. And it's making our job much harder and more expensive. Again, the list of cable, bona fide, malicious cable attacks, sabotage, seems pretty short. And industry still is the mover behind all of this. They have the repair ships, they have the expertise, et cetera, et cetera. And so in many respects, it's hard to write this in a policy brief because policy recommendations are supposed to tell people what to do. They generally don't tell people what not to do. And so it's hard to to say everybody should stop talking about cables, especially when, of course, I'm talking to you about cables, and it's something I enjoy doing. But yeah, I think overall, private industry's done a fantastic job. So this goes on to your next question, though. So it does seem that we're facing a new era, okay? And as Kay Akatis in my book says, we're navigating geopolitics at the dawn of a new age, right? And therefore, maybe something like these NATO standards, what CCDCOE in Tallinn has done with cybersecurity, maybe we're looking at something similar. Is that kind of a gold standard? Possibly. Yeah, that's a good starting point. What the Quads tried to do is a good starting point too. Although NATO, given the fact that it is this block and gold standard alliance, is a little more synced up in terms of its ability to do things together. So it's probably a good starting point. Great questions.
Yeah, so to add to this, Natalie, she already asked a few questions, but she's saying that, is NATO leveraging the role of the J9 to deal with the civil-military intersections required to deal with these issues? The J9 is a key component within the joint staff that manages relationship between the military and civilian organizations. Ideally, they had the relevant security clearance and authorities to be briefed on the issues and involved in their resolution. So again, a question on NATO and J9.
Yeah, again, I don't know. I'm glad you defined for me what J9 was or is. Yeah, I don't know, but it seems like, again, this is something that needs to happen in terms of how we share data and how we develop policies. Is you've got to have people with relevant clearances, and this is something NATO offers. We don't have, of course, anything like that Quad at this point. We're getting closer to that. Like I said, the appetite is there, the intent is there, and I regularly point out to people that this is really startling and surprising in many respects, given that usually we don't see even the beginnings of an entente cordiale, if you will, before the advent of conflict itself. And the fact that India, Japan, Australia, and the United States have been talking security in earnest since 2007, but okay, let's date to 2017 with leader summits every year now, is pretty telling in terms of that synchronicity about threat perception. So yeah, I wish I could give you a more robust answer on the J9, but I don't.
Thank you, Brendon. Now we have a question from Sakshi. She's saying that my question is, how effective is the UN clause in protecting undersea cables during peacetime and conflict, and where are its blind spots?
Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to say I don't know all of these questions. No. So UNCLOS, there's been a lot written on this, but UNCLOS seems a very imperfect tool in general. Okay, that's fine. It's as good as we're going to get as far as an international agreement, and I'm personally fully supportive of UNCLOS, and I think states that aren't signatories, like my own, probably should become signatories. But yeah, this doesn't really address the undersea cable. It's a beginning in terms of those legal sea areas and jurisdictions and things like that. But this really goes down to the national level and national appetites for protecting infrastructure. Australia is probably furthest along in this. There were some great articles written by Australian think tanks and scholars over the past few years on, for example, Australia's cable gold standard. This is something that I brought up in the undersea cable article in Marine Policy about how the Quad is operationalizing this. And that works for Australia. That gold standard seems to be the gold standard. The thing is that my understanding is when Australians went to other Quad countries as well as third countries, say in Southeast Asia, for example, to kind of talk about this and gauge the appetite of these states for something like a gold standard for cables, they found out that it's rather complex. Try to delimit territorial seas, EEZs, and legally define and push those limits in the Bay of Bengal, for example. Everybody knows where everybody's claims are, everybody knows, and there may be general consensus overall, and no tension really about those. But again, it's not easy. Same thing in Southeast Asia, for example, for obvious reasons. And so you've got to take a national and regional seas approach to this, or look at cables in isolation, as one of the other questioners brought up. But that's where we're at right now.
On a slightly different note, the next question asks, the question is by Gaurav, and he's asking that, what, in your view, is the impact of a deep sea cable network on aquatic environment?
Very little. Yeah, in terms of my understanding is in terms of what's bad for marine life and the blue economy, et cetera, that undersea cables are quite benign. And so, yeah, I don't think that there's really any problems with these. I think, you know, your IUU fishing, for example, that also severs cables quite often with their anchors is a much bigger problem. And that list would be very long before you'd possibly find undersea cables on that list. That's my understanding.
Okay. So next question is by Hajira Ahmed. And the question is, can Professor Brendon point out some measures that have already been taken to protect undersea cables and have proven to be good enough so far?
Yeah, well, what private industry's done is good. But I will point out something that's quite interesting in terms of limiting our exposure, or limiting our exposure to, for example, greater access to the cable laying, operating, and repairing world by China. Okay. Again, you can view this as a very negative thing. You can view this as a positive thing. I'm agnostic on it, but I will point out that what the United States did, in particular, prior to the Quads cable announcement, this began, as I mentioned in my comments, back in 2018, certainly by 2019. They promulgated a Cable Act. The United States did, and it was interested in attempting to limit Huawei's or HMN Tech's access to that market. This was done quietly. It was done in places like the Western Indian Ocean. And what the US offered was, say, a cable was to be built from the Arabian Peninsula to East Africa. And the stakeholders involved in that were looking at a bid, or the private industry that was building that was looking at a bid for who was going to do it. Chinese industry often underbids everybody else. That's not a surprise. And so what the US offered would be capacity building and technical assistance should the stakeholder making the decision on that bid choose any other cable option besides HMN Tech. This seems to have been quite successful. Again, is limiting HMN Tech's access to the cable market a good thing, a bad thing? Is it making the world more secure, less secure? I'm not sure. Because what I'm just pointing this out as an example, because what the effect could be of what we're seeing in, for example, the Western Indian Ocean, where major data companies like Google, Meta, Apple, American companies, are being urged by Washington to avoid landfall for any new cables in China or Hong Kong, which is effectively part of China now, and route them through Taiwan or elsewhere, is that we're developing into these walled off networks. We're not there yet, and we're not going to be there for a very long time, the way data is transmitted around in these cables, right? But this is where we're moving into this fragmented or balkanized world, which we haven't had before now. It's been pretty seamless. geopolitical rivalry has been kind of not part of the conversation with undersea cables, even during the Cold War, apparently. So that's worrisome. Ideally, if things could remain the same as they have been, where private industry is largely taking care of this and doing this, that would be, I think, the best option out of this. But I'm not sure that we can put the genie back in the bottle at this point.
Thank you, Brandon. So Dr. Ramanan Garge is asking, with the rising use of satellite for high-speed communication, how you look at the future of undersea cables?
It's assured. The satellites cannot even begin to handle the amount of data that undersea cables can. In fact, terrestrial cables can't handle the amount of data that undersea cables handle. So even if we have Starlink times 100 million, it's still not going to be able to handle the amount of data, is my understanding. And remember, our appetite and the amount of data we're generating is only growing. So the short answer is satellites can't do it and won't be able to do it for the foreseeable future.
Right. So I think
I just want to also add there,
yes.
Mansi, I'll just also
Yeah.
add there, satellites are also highly vulnerable to attack as well. They're easily seen. Everyone knows where they are. You can see them. Technically, they can be jammed. So they as sort of archaic as it sounds, cables buried deep under the ocean in trenches actually offer greater security and are much harder targets than satellites floating around.
Good point.
Yeah, thank you both of you for this answer. But we have, I mean, there is a similar question, and which is by Himanshu. And the question is there any possibility in near future for a satellite network like Starlink, for example, someday replacing the need and requirement of subsea infrastructure? Would that be good or all bad?
Well, the answer is no. And right now, again, I don't know what great things Elon Musk, although he seems rather busy in Washington right now, what he has planned for us. But the short answer is no. And whether it's a good or bad thing, I don't know. I'd probably rather see undersea cables underneath the ocean than a bunch of more space junk flying around up above us. Yeah, so maybe that's the good thing, is to stick with undersea cables. But that's what I study. I don't study satellites, so of course I'd say that.
Thank you, Brandon. There's a question on Quad Alliance. Sarah Zafar is asking, why is undersea cable security becoming a concern for the Quad Alliance?
Well, this goes back to, I think we can date this to Nord Stream, which isn't an undersea cable. It's a gas pipeline, right? But it's underwater infrastructure. So this is really when things kind of got heated up. Prior to that, though, you've got CCDCOE in Tallinn, the NATO Cyber Center for Excellence. In 2019, they put out a paper on undersea cables. So there were already people looking at this, right? And so, but I think that the Quad is it talks security, and it's looking for areas of consensus, right? And one of the areas that they could find consensus on was that this critical undersea infrastructure is vulnerable as geopolitical tensions rise, particularly with China, and therefore this is something we should look at more seriously. So that would be the short answer. Remember, the Indo-Pacific is largely still maritime and maritime focused. And so hence things under, on, and above the seas are of prime interest to the Quad, which is kind of that architecture that upholds, promulgates, forces and is the ideas generator behind with these Indo-Pacific concepts and strategies.
Thank you, Brandon. We have a question by Bijli. The question is, how do the competing naval modernization programs of the key Indo-Pacific nations, coupled with the dual-use nature of deep-sea research vessels, contribute to the potential for both state and non-state actors to pose a threat to undersea communication cable infrastructure in strategically significant choke points like Malacca Strait and South China Sea?
Yeah, so this is the question about as we develop more robust measures to protect undersea infrastructure, but also because everything is dual use as you mentioned. So it's offensive and defensive at the same time. Then what happens like drones, missiles, et cetera, when they fall into the hands of malicious non-state actors like the Houthi in Yemen? Yeah, so technically it does make them more vulnerable. But as I've noted, it's attacking shipping is one thing where it hurts. It hurts a variety of different states. It hurts the owner of the ship. It hurts, for example, the Egyptians with the Suez Canal traffic. It hurts states like Somaliland and Ethiopia, for example, Port of Berbera, where there's no ship traffic, right? Undersea cables, that's not quite the case because as I've tried to get across, but in a non-technical way, I know the technical way, when you sever a cable, who are you actually hurting? Right. So I realize there are malicious actors out there who are simply interested in destruction and throwing a spanner in the works of, say, international order, secure shipping lines of communication, for example, these type of things, and perhaps that's where the problem would come in. I think in talking with colleagues and fellow scholars like Dr. Pujavat in Delhi, she mentioned that increasingly in undersea infrastructure, but cables in particular, that it could be non-state actors who are funded and equipped by state actors that perform these kind of nasty tasks. So certainly there is a problem there. It will be hybrid warfare in nature. And I think it's probably on the rise, unfortunately.
Thank you, Brandon. Now we have a question by Prachi. She is an intern with us and she's from the Goa University. You might have met her during the conference. So she's saying, to what extent does the Hokkaido-Sakhalin undersea cable system reflect shifting geopolitical alignments and a strategic interdependence between Japan and Russia in the context of Northeast Asian connectivity and Arctic-bound infrastructure diplomacy? And also, in what ways does the construction and maintenance of Hokkaido-Sakhalin undersea cable system intersect with environmental stewardship, marine ecology, and socio-technical challenges of laying submarine cable in tectonically active region?
Yeah, okay. Interesting questions. So this is something I'll have an answer for you in about 3 months. Okay, how's that? I'm starting a project at Waterloo University next month on regional seas approach to cables, and one of the areas I'm looking at is the Sea of Japan and that wider region, because you've got, no surprise, cable connectivity and lots of it between Japan and South Korea. Regional rivals, if you will. They certainly have difficult relations, complex relations, but you also have cables, as you pointed out, the Hokkaido-Sakhalin cable between Japan and the island of Sakhalin. And so that's interesting. I mean, again, this is not a new cable. You need connectivity. Despite the disputes over the islands, like the Kuril Islands with Japan and Russia and Sakhalin itself, this is one of the things I want to explore, is how do rivals who have never signed a peace treaty after World War II, by the way, deal with cable connectivity and ensuring the communications still flow. And that's precisely the reason I chose this area, this regional sea, is to figure that out. I don't necessarily have an answer in terms of that, but yeah. So in terms of tectonic plates and issues, again, this is the Ring of Fire, right? This is earthquake central, and so needless to say, there needs to be some kind of measures in place to repair these cables. And the bigger threat is not it comes from natural disasters rather than from, say, malicious man-made and threats here. And so NEC Japan, being one of the three huge cable operators and having cable repair ships, would be the one likely responsible for that repair should it happen. So again, Japan sits in a good position in terms of being able to take care of its cables and repair them and those in its near abroad, which are important for it. How important that connectivity is to Japan as compared to those on Sakhalin Island is another question. My guess is that the Sakhalin Islanders, the Russians, need that information and communication a lot more than the Japanese do. So that's also an interesting thing to look at when we look at cable connectivity. And maybe this would be a nice cable to target should conflict occur, although I'm not advocating anything of the sort.
Thank you, Brandon, for such a explained answer. Next question is on public-private partnership and its impact on tackling the issues surrounding the security of cables. So the question is, what effect do you think differences in general bureaucratic culture in terms of states' appetite on working with private industries has on tackling issues surrounding security of cables? So that is a question by Sukhmani Dev.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it has a lot to do with it. It's very clear, as I mentioned, that we don't have our houses in order, that even who responds in the time of a cable emergency is unclear in most states. Who is the regulatory authority? You have multiple regulatory, you have one, for example, in Delhi, but are there multiple elsewhere, or they have oversight for certain regions, or states? For example, that's a good question. I mean, one of the things that's pointed out to me by my friend and colleague Christian Buger a few years back, or a few months back, was look at the Mediterranean Sea itself, right? This is an inland sea. We know who's on either side of it. It's very clear. Look at the cable connectivity of the Mediterranean Sea, right? Okay, maybe we can find the information for who is responsible for cables in Italy, for example, and in France. What about the southern side of the Mediterranean? Who's responsible in Algeria? Is that information even public, right? Tunisia. Okay, now get to Libya. Who does what, where, how? Is it the eastern part of Libya? Is the western part of Libya? This is what we're dealing with. It's very, very, very complex. So what happens if a cable is severed connecting different parts of the Mediterranean and it makes landfall in a place like Derna in Libya? So again, with this regional seas approach, I've chosen Sea of Japan. I've chosen the Western Indian Ocean, but I'm focusing more on, say, Seychelles, Mauritius, Madagascar, Kenya, Somalia, but also the Gulf of Guinea in West Africa, because here you've got interesting cable connectivity that mostly stretches from, say, Nigeria and Ghana and elsewhere up around past Senegal to Portugal. All right. And so on the one hand, lots of cable connectivity, but extremely vulnerable. First, because the cables all run the same way. Second, because when they make landfall in, say, Lagos, then it feeds inland to all those inland Sahelian states that are completely reliant on this. So who does what, where, and how? What's the difference between Anglophone and Francophone? Do they even talk about this stuff? Because tensions, for example, are often quite high. Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, for example, or in the midst of a small naval arms race. Again, I don't want to emphasize, I don't want to exaggerate that, but this is what we're dealing with here. So, yeah, when I say the world is fragmented in terms of global governance of cables or governance of cables in general, it's really fragmented.
Thank you, Brandon. Do you have a couple of more minutes? We can take just last two questions. Is that, if that's
Sure.
okay with you? Okay.
Sure.
So there is a question on Korea. The question is, what kind of positioning should Korea take in cable competition? For example, the United States, France, and Japan have a strength in this field. What action can Korea take?
That's up to the Koreans. I mean, you've got world-beating industries that could probably jump into this cable game if they wanted to. It's a question of what's the opportunity space and the amount of risk they want to take. But I don't think they would be viewed as necessarily malicious actors in the same vein that, say, HNN Tech was by Quad states. Relations between South Korea and Japan are rather complex, but I don't think Japan would be doing things beyond normal business savvy things to limit their exposure to, say, a Samsung, a cable line company. But yeah, I don't really know the answer to that.
Okay. We'll take the last question, although we have a few more questions there. From our friend from Pakistan, Javed Ali. The question is, how does the intensification of the Indo-US strategic partnership within the Indo-Pacific strategy impact the security and geopolitical stability of South Asia, particularly regarding Pakistan's regional interest and alliances? And the second question is, what role do undersea communication cable play in shaping the strategic undercurrents of Indo-Pacific, and how might their vulnerability influence security dynamics and power equations in South Asia?
Okay, so let's take the first part of the question, which is a huge question. Look, it's quite clear, although there is the variable of the Donald Trump administration at play, so we'll keep that in mind. But it's quite clear that the trajectory overall over the past 10 years has been closer India-US relations, despite decades of mistrust, particularly during the Cold War, despite concerns on both sides. The overall view is that there's something bigger that we need to deal with in common. And of course, I've said this in most forums about the Indo-Pacific, but the engine that drives the Quad is China, okay? I don't mean to put the ball in China's court all the time, but it's very clear that we wouldn't have the Quad if it wasn't for the actions of China. And this is not just its economic rise, please don't get me wrong. This was supported to the hilt by the United States, by Japan, Taiwan, and even India, okay? And so, as my friend Kei Hakata likes to point out, there are two countries that are least impressed by the rise of China in Asia, and those are Japan and Taiwan, because they supported it, and they funded it, okay? So this goes beyond the economic factor, okay? Although that's a critical piece now, but it wasn't 25 years ago, and it wasn't in the 1990s, and it certainly wasn't in the 1980s. So that trajectory then has to do with the actions that China's taken and the really difficult relationship it has with most of its neighbors. It has difficult relations with almost every single one of its neighbors, all right? Pakistan is a slight exception here, all right? Although Pakistan and Beijing, despite their all-weather friendship, have their major differences, which I'm sure you'll concede. But this is particularly problematic, I think, for Pakistan at this point, because the mood in much of Eurasia now, and certainly in North America, is that China is a problem. Ipso facto, if you're throwing your lot in with Beijing, especially when it comes to Eurasian attempts at Eurasian hegemony, right? Then there's going to be potentially a problem. So I think it might play against Pakistan's national interests here. not that the United States is some silver bullet, as Pakistan knows very well. The United States is an extremely difficult, complex customer to deal with, and can be viewed very fairly as a fair weather friend. And so, but I think that the Indo-American rapprochement, and it's more than that now, is going to have a major effect in the Indian Ocean basin. The U.S. is a resident power in the Indian Ocean. The Indians are also very much, by nature of geography, but also by nature of their military force and their Navy in particular, a resident power in the Indian Ocean. And so, again, I think this is the reality that Pakistan is going to deal with and has been dealing with, and I'm not telling you anything new. So what was the second part of the question?
The second part of the question is, what role do undersea communication cables play in shaping the strategic undercurrents of Indo-Pacific, and how might their vulnerability influence security dynamics and power equations in South Asia?
Okay, well, so I don't know that undersea cables really play a huge role in this. It's just one more facet of that kind of sync up between the Quad partners. Okay, they're not dealing with undersea cable, and they're not addressing undersea cable security in a common manner at all at this point. Okay, again, Australia has the lead on this, but because of, and this goes back to one of the previous questions, because of bureaucratic culture, because of security culture, et cetera, because we don't really know, with the exception of possibly Australia, what our own house is doing yet vis-a-vis cables. This all needs to be tackled first, okay? But undersea cables are just one of many of the security interests of the Quad, which remains, as I mentioned, largely maritime in nature. And so everything from maritime domain awareness, which they've made huge strides on, to the sharing of sensitive data, which they're having fits and starts with. This is all part of a more, it's engendered by a consensus that we've got a common problem, and how do we best address that? And what can we do to be prepared for when we really need to take steps to do this? I don't want to exaggerate the Quad. I don't want to say it's an alliance. It's not even anything close to it. It's an informal talk shop, but it's clearly something more than a talk shop. And like BRICS, it matters simply because it exists. Although I would say the Quad has done a lot more than BRICS has, and is likely to do a lot more than BRICS ever will. So I'll end on that.
Thank you so much for addressing so patiently all the questions. And to sum up your talk and the questions that you have answered, I have just, maybe you can just call it the summing up question. As in, because see, in one of the slides, you mentioned about establishing norms and how difficult it is to establish a norm in this domain. But as the world woke up for this cybersecurity threat, and there was whole talk about global governance and how to come up with rules and regulations to govern it. Do you see, with this emerging threat of the undersea cables and how important they are? Because if they are cut off, the whole world, I mean, it can go dark. There will be no communication. So do you see that in near future, the world will wake up and there will be talk of the global governance on, how to regulate and how to, come together, the government, the private players and all, and they can just come up with something to regulate this whole undersea cable thing? Over to you.
Yeah, good question. I'm not answering yes to the, that's not my answer. It's yes, it's a good question. There's not much chance at this point. There's something called the ICPC, right? Which is the, I don't know, International Cable Protection Committee or something like that. It's largely private industry. It's a lot about business. It's a lot about getting business continuity, making sure that the cable industry is operating at a maximum level, et cetera, et cetera. So some have floated that idea. I've written about that in a couple of things with colleagues as well. This is one of the possible venues for this. ICPC has been joined. Anybody can join this, right? And entities from different states can join this. So I believe the Indian Navy, for example, is a member of ICPC. A lot of US entities are, a lot of Japanese entities are. I think even a Chinese entity is. I don't know that any Russian are, but so that's one place where potentially there can be some talk. The obvious space is the UN, UNCLOS, looking at things like that. I don't know that we're there yet. This certainly isn't rising to the level of national security concerns for most states around the world. Quad's talking about it. Certainly China views this as important. States like Pakistan certainly do. Russia does, the European Union, but again, we're doing research in places like West Africa or East Africa. How many people think about undersea cables? I mean, not just common people on the street, but people in national governments in Abuja or in Nairobi. So I don't know that we're anywhere close to getting consensus on that yet. So the global governance thing is going to be hard. And I think that at the end of the day, if this is important to states like it is for India, in Japan and Australia and others, then they need to really work on this in their regions and take approaches that are appropriate for their regions, because that's really the only way to do this at this point.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for such a deep and thought-provoking session which we had. And my apologies to the audience if I did not take all your questions. We do have some time limitations. Now I would like to call Hugh. Please just give your concluding remarks. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Brendon Cannon, for such a great presentation. On behalf of the Indo-Pacific Study Centre, I want to extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Cannon for his insightful and timely presentation. Your analysis of undersea communication cables and their incredible strategic relevance to the Indo-Pacific was both, I think, urgent and incredibly illuminating. It's not something as you think of in your day-to-day life, you just take it for granted, and you hear stories of cables being torn up by ships, which does cause some alarm, and you just hope the world or people will take the appropriate measures, but clearly that can't be taken for granted. So thank you again for such a great presentation, and I hope that you'll join us at our conference in October and be very kind enough to give it an equally illuminating presentation then, if you're able to. I'd also like to thank as well everyone in all the attendees today from across all the regions and sectors across the Indo-Pacific and beyond for taking time to engage in this very important conversation. The high level of participation certainly underscores the growing recognition that infrastructure security is central to regional strategies in the Indo-Pacific. So just on closing, as you know, this session forms part of the Indo-Pacific Study Centre's broader commitment to advancing a critical dialogue across the Indo-Pacific. So we encourage everyone to stay involved and keep in touch through our policy briefings, our leadership programs, and of course, our next webinar, which is probably in the end of this month. We'll announce that probably this week. And of course, the upcoming State of the Indo-Pacific Conference in October. So again, thank you, Brendon, for such a great presentation. It's always exciting to hear things that expand your knowledge. And that's really what we're hoping to achieve. And you've certainly achieved that and given that to all our attendees today. So thank you very much. And I would say until next time, thank you again. And we'll stay safe and stay connected. And I'll pass it back. Thank you.
Everyone, bye-bye. Have a nice evening. Have a good night, wonderful day, depending on your time zone. And hope to see you soon for our next session. Thank you, Brad, once again. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for
much.
having me, Mansi. Thank you. It's great. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much to the audience as well for great questions.
Yes.
Thank you so much for answering them so patiently.
Yes.
Pleasure.
Enjoy the
All
rest
right.
of your day, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks very much. Cheerio, everyone. Bye.